Well, hello everybody, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for spending a few minutes with me today as we focus on what I call a recap of both the rough draft and peer review process. And the reason I wanted to take this time together to address these ideas is the fact that we are at that point in the term when we're starting to really narrow down and put the finishing touches on our rough drafts. And for some of you, that means the peer review process will also follow. So I thought it would be beneficial to kind of revisit the concept of the rough draft, its importance, what it involves, what it contains, and then also that peer review process. And these are ideas that we've looked at over the course of the last few weeks. And there are other recordings that are available in both the learning community and your classrooms that further develop these ideas if you wanted to view those as refreshers. But for our purposes tonight, again, we're going to serve a recap of the rough draft and peer review. So as we begin, I really have just a few objectives slash questions to consider that we're going to focus on in our time together. And it's going to, again, serve as that review process, but we're going to focus on why is the rough draft important? What should it contain? The importance of peer review, and then just a few final thoughts of our time together. So as we begin, I wanted to start with what is a rough draft. And, as we looked at the rough draft over the course of the term, we really see it as the first step of the writing process towards the final completion of your work. Up until this point in time, if we focus on the differing milestones that have developed, the differing elements of the work that slowly come together that you've submitted to your instructor, they've seen your work in bits and pieces. They've looked at your sources, they've looked at your thesis statement, they've looked at the different elements that are slowly making your work, and it's starting to come together. Now, in the form of the rough draft, you have that opportunity to pull all of these ideas together. You have this opportunity to submit a rough draft to show your instructor where you're at this point in time. And as I referenced, this is the first time they have that ability to see your completed work together. And what's important to note is the fact that you've moved beyond those very, what I'll call piecemeal approaches between source identification, analysis, the thesis statement. All of that, it's now coming together. You're assembling your ideas in a coherent format that reflects the working outline that you've developed while completing your research. One key important element that I would note regarding what the rough draft is not, it is not taking earlier milestones and simply pasting them into a rough draft. One key idea that we do want to keep in mind when we focus on the development of a research project is the fact that, whether they're milestones or you're doing something outside of an academic program, the research process has key elements. There's steps that you ultimately complete in working towards that final project. So what I mean by that is when we look at the purposes of the milestones, your research is going to continue to advance beyond each individual milestone. So as that research process happens, you're going to now have the opportunity to expand upon those ideas within the milestones that you've presented. And that is that research process in action. What you submitted, for example, in milestone 1 or milestone 2 should not be all the more research that you've done on your project. That was the outline. That was the initial annotated bibliography, for example, whatever the case may be. My point is that as your research moves forward, as you move towards the writing of the rough draft, and then ultimately that final draft, things are going to continue to develop. You're going to continue to identify sources. You're going to continue to look at different arguments. You're going to continue to make your argument. Now that you're in the rough draft stage, that's what you're presenting. You're presenting your research up to this point. And one key element to keep in mind is the fact that the rough draft is rough. That's its purpose. Perfection is not expected. And we're going to further develop this idea here in a few minutes. But the rough draft should not be viewed as the final draft in regards to submission. It should be rough and no perfection. Now, why is the rough draft important? Well, it gives you the opportunity to begin the process of formulating your thoughts. As I referenced a few minutes ago, You're pulling all of these ideas together. You're pulling your source analysis together. You're pulling, how all the sources work together to help you make your argument. You also, now that you're in that writing stage, have the opportunity to see what gaps you may have in your work. It's very easy to think, as we're working through various milestones or various research steps, that we have all our bases covered. But once we start to look at the overall project, we look at our overall research, it's much easier to identify gaps that are present. And you now have that ability to do that by writing and focusing on what you've developed thus far and helping you to understand what you need to do as you then work towards that final draft. Now, at the academic level, when we focus on why is the rough draft important, you can demonstrate your progress to your instructor thus far. As I referenced before, they've seen your work in various milestones. Now they get to see your overall research process, what it looks like, the argument you're making, seeing all of these ideas come together. And you're also going to provide insight for them as to where you're going as you conclude your research. Because remember, as I just said on the previous slide, your rough draft is not going to be complete. It should be rough. So they're going to have the idea and ability to see where you're going and what your next steps are as you work towards that final draft. And it also gives you the opportunity to coherently organize your thoughts. And that is very important and directly related to that concept of formulating your thoughts and identifying any gaps that are present within your research. Now, when we look at what the rough draft should contain, well, obviously it's going to need an introduction where you're going to introduce your paper to the reader. It's going to contain a thesis, your research, your conclusions / research argument, a summation of your work, and very, very importantly for a rough draft, it's going to contain an outline for incomplete sections. And you might initially think, well, why would I need an outline for incomplete sections? Well, if we go back to that idea about your rough draft being rough and that perfection is not expected, your rough draft may not be complete. Now, when I say it might not be complete, I'm referencing your overall research project. And this is really kind of exemplified when we look at assignment requirements, for example. One of the things I've often said is look at the rubric. What's the rubric requirement? And when you look at a rubric for the rough draft, it might have a set page number. That set page number could very well differ from the final project, and I can guarantee you that it almost always will. Now, why is that? Well, that's, again, directly related to the concept that your rough draft is not going to be complete. So when we focus on the idea that the rough draft is not your completed research project, you're going to want to let your instructor know where you're going. How are you going to finish it? What ideas are you presenting? What ideas are you going to further develop? Are you going to look into any other research aspects that you need to complete? So while the rough draft is not the completed draft, your ideas need to be presented. It's very, very important to let the instructor know where you're going. And it also ensures that you do meet all the requirements of the rough draft, because obviously there's going to be rubric requirements that do need to be present, and your instructor will need to see those ideas presented as well. Now, as we shift our focus a little bit and move to peer review, because after the rough draft is completed, a lot of times we'll move into the peer review process, and I know some course sections do have an active peer review process related to the rough draft that will be completed by your classmates. So peer review is very, very important, and as I referenced earlier, it is something that is done on multiple occasions within the discipline, something the historian routinely participates in, and something that you participate in too in each one of your class sections as it relates to engaging with your classmates and providing ideas and analyzing ideas that are presented. So when we look at a definition of peer review, it's an evaluation of scientific, academic, or professional work by others working in the same field. So therefore, you as a peer reviewer are going to be evaluating work within the discipline of history. Now, it's very important to focus on what peer review is not. And I always like to spend a little bit of time on this and re-emphasizing these points, because when we focus on peer review, I totally understand there can be a nervous element of, presenting your work, and especially if you've never done it before. You've never posted your rough draft. You've never put yourself out there in that way and said, here's my work. Tell me what I did wrong. Okay? That's not how you want to think about it. You are looking at peer review and participating in peer review as a growing experience. It's a learning opportunity. And when we focus on that idea of a learning opportunity, peer review is not harsh criticism. It's not a waste of time. It's not unnecessary. And it's not a personal attack on the author. Okay? And it's very important to note that in order to complete peer review, you do not need to be an expert on the topic to provide peer review. You will be providing peer review within the discipline of history. Therefore, you will be using your skills that you're developing to become a historian to focus on critical thinking, analysis. I presented ideas. Has an argument been made? Are sources supported? You're looking on those higher level critical thinking skills to look at the work. You're not an expert on the topic, and you don't have to be. And I think you can make a case for the fact that you provide a better peer review by not having a thorough understanding of the topic, by not being an expert on the topic, because you are really being more objective in your overall review of the work. You're placing the focus on the review, and you actually get to step back from the work and really focus on, did the author do what they said they were going to do? And when we think about the value of that to the writer, if I've written something and I have the ability to present it to somebody to read and tell me, no, you did not do what you said you're going to do, I want to know that, because I want to make sure that before I submit my final draft, I have covered all of my bases. I've made my argument. I have set myself up to be successful with the research that I've completed. When we write, and this is directly related to the importance of the rough draft as well, I always tell students, we know what we want to write. And we always think that we wrote what we had planned to do. But sometimes we have gaps that we don't realize because the idea that we had doesn't always make itself to the paper. And that's important, and that's just something as it relates to writing, because we've completed the research, we've immersed ourselves in the topic, and now all of a sudden we're presenting the ideas. And it's very helpful to step back from your work and have another individual take a look at it. And that is the value of peer review. So don't think of it as harsh criticism. Don't think of it as a waste of time. Think of it as something that is very, very valuable to your work and to your growth and future development as both a historian, which is what you're studying to become, and to your overall writing skills. Because remember, the writing process itself is never complete. We're always developing and we're always growing within that process. Now, in terms of providing peer review, as the reviewer, you're the one who's completing the review. You want to take time to read the rough draft submission thoroughly. Keep in mind that you are critiquing the piece, not the person. Okay, you are focusing on helping the author achieve his or her goal. So, as you are reading your work, you want to make sure that you are focusing on the work that's in front of you. You want to keep your personal judgment about the subject matter to yourself, because you might be writing on a topic that you're not too fond of, so therefore you might think it's just boring by nature of what it's being written of, and that's not the case. You're looking at the argument. Did they achieve their goal? You also want to review the paper that is written, not the paper you think the author should have written. This is very, very important, especially if you do happen to be reviewing a paper on a topic in which you happen to have an advanced knowledge of the subject material. Okay? Again, you're reviewing the paper that is written, not the paper that you think the author should have written. Did they make their argument? Did they analyze what was written and what is in front of you? Very important to keep in mind and focus on. Now, as receiving peer review, again, remember, it's not harsh criticism. You're going to read the critique of your rough draft submission carefully. And when you read it carefully, you want to avoid any desire to defend your choices. You want to ask questions if needed, seek clarification. Maybe the author of your review provided a whole lot of feedback, but you're still wondering, Is my analysis solid enough? Should I have went a little bit further? Because peer review, as if once you've received the peer review, I should say, it should not completely agree with everything that you've written. And what do I mean when I say agree? Well, if you're reading a critique of your work and everything is a great job, I really liked how you did this, and this, and things like that, it's not going to help you. It's not going to be that deeper level analysis. So if that's what you see in the provided review, you're going to want to go back. You're going to want to ask questions on the analysis, on the source identification. Has the argument been made? And I think once you receive peer review, and when you are providing peer review, it really helps you understand the differing steps and the benefit of being an effective reviewer and an effective reviewee. Two differing ideas that ultimately work together, and we can see how they work together by being on both ends of that spectrum. You also, as the author of a work, want to make sure that you take note of repeated commentary on the same issue. If you're seeing the same comment made over and over again, that could signify a problem, and it's an area for improvement. And finally, do not take the critique personally. Keep in mind that it's an evaluation of the paper, not you as the author. The work is what is being reviewed, not you. Okay, so don't hesitate to ask questions. Step back and read the critique a couple times if you need to. Take a break in between, walk away, make sure that you have that clear train of thought. And most importantly, have an open mind. It's not a personal attack. It's not harsh criticism. Final thoughts to conclude with in our time together. I just wanted to remind you that the rough draft and peer review are both designed to improve your writing. The rough draft's important. You do want to complete it and not overlook it because it is a critical writing piece. Again, it'll be rough. Submit it. Incorporate your instructor's feedback into the final draft. Keep in mind that there are differences in the assignment requirements between the rough draft and the final draft. And I always tell students, if you did excellent on the rough draft, take a look at that feedback. Make sure that you've highlighted and outlined and included the elements of the final draft. Don't assume that just because you did really well on the rough draft, now the final draft is done. No. Ideas continue to develop. You will continue to focus on the overall topic, providing analysis, and making your argument. Have a solid understanding of the key elements of both the rough draft and the final draft as you complete each critical step of the writing process. If you have any questions or need assistance, please reach out to your instructor or post your questions in the learning community. We are all more than happy to assist, and we want to play a part in your success. Also, stop by the learning community for additional resources, historical facts, or to start a discussion.